There are battles fought on fields of dirt with swords of iron, and then there are battles fought in the silent, terrifying courtrooms of the spirit, where the prize is not a piece of land, but the eternal soul of a man. Before we step into the upper room to witness the moment the curtain of the invisible world was pulled back, may the Almighty God protect and bring abundance to those who subscribe and like this content for our efforts. It might seem simple to you, but it brings us great joy. Also, please mention in the comments which part of the world you are watching from, what emotion this story gave you, and do you believe? It will make us happy to reply to your comments. Now, let us enter Jerusalem, on a night heavy with the scent of roasting lamb and the impending doom of the Son of Man. The city was bursting at the seams. It was Passover, the night of the watch, the night when the blood of the Lamb had once saved Israel from the destroyer in Egypt. But in a secluded upper room in the Essene quarter of the city, the true Lamb was preparing to face a destroyer far more ancient and malice-filled than the one who had passed over the Nile. The air in the room was thick, not just with the smoke of the oil lamps or the smell of the unleavened bread, but with a tension that vibrated in the bones of the 12 men reclined around the low table. They had just finished the meal. They had watched their master, the one they believed would conquer Rome and restore the throne of David, strip himself to the waist like a common slave and wash the road dust from their feet. It was a confusing, humbling act that left them unsettled, and then, the bombshell. "One of you will betray me." The words had sucked the oxygen out of the room. Accusations had flown. Eyes had darted around the table, suspicious and fearful. And then Judas Iscariot, possessing a piece of bread dipped in the bitter herbs, a sop of friendship, had risen. His face was a mask of cold resolve, or perhaps possessed by a panic he could not control. He had gone out into the night. And, as the chronicler John would later write with chilling simplicity, and it was night. With the traitor gone, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It should have been a relief, a cleansing. But instead, a strange madness took hold of the remaining 11. It was a madness born of insecurity and the terrifying vacuum of leadership they sensed was coming. Jesus had spoken of leaving them. He had spoken of death. Panic began to transmute into bravado. If he was leaving, who would take charge? Who was the greatest? Who had the most faith? The argument began in whispers but grew into a heated debate. Peter sat at the table, his chest heaving with indignation. He was the rock. He was the one who had walked on water, at least for a few steps. He was the one who had confessed at Caesarea Philippi, "You are the Christ." How could James and John, or even Thomas, question his primacy? The dispute was ugly. It was the sound of chaff grinding against chaff. Here they were, hours away from the crucifixion of their Lord, arguing about their own glory. Jesus watched them. His eyes, heavy with the sorrow of the coming Gethsemane, moved from face to face. He saw their ambition. He saw their pride. But he saw something else, something that made the hair on the back of a neck stand up. He saw into the spiritual dimension that overlay the physical room. He saw the shadows lengthening in the corners, shadows that were not cast by the lamps. He saw the enemy. Satan was not merely a concept to Jesus. He was a person, a legal adversary, a roaring lion who prowled about seeking someone to devour. And tonight, the lion was circling the table. The argument about who is the greatest was not just human weakness, it was the smell of blood in the water. Pride is the devil's native language, and the disciples were speaking it fluently. Jesus silenced the argument not with a shout, but with a statement that realigned the universe. The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, but not so with you. He redefined greatness as service. He promised them a kingdom, yes, but a kingdom built on sacrifice. Then, the room went quiet. The argument died down. Jesus turned his body on the reclined couch so that he was facing Peter directly. The other disciples faded into the background. The conversation that was about to happen was public, yet intensely private. It was a general warning delivered to a specific target. "Simon, Simon." The use of the name startled Peter. Jesus hadn't called him Simon in a long time. He was Peter, the rock, Petros. Simon was his old name, the name of the impulsive fisherman, the son of Jonah, the man of flesh and blood and instability. The repetition of the name, Simon, Simon, was a Hebraic sign of deep affection and urgent warning. It was the sound of a mother calling a child away from the edge of a cliff. "Behold," Jesus said. The word commanded absolute attention. "Look, see what I see. Pull back the veil." Satan has demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. The translation in the ears of the disciples was terrifying. The Greek word exedomai meant to demand the surrender of someone to carry out a trial or punishment. It was a legal term. Satan had gone before the throne of God, just as he had in the days of Job. He had pointed a spectral finger at the upper room, at the squabbling, proud, ambitious men. Look at them, the accuser would have said. They claim to be yours. They claim to be loyal. But look at them fighting over seats of honor while you prepare to die. They are full of chaff. They are hollow. They are mine. Give them to me. Let me shake them. Let me crush them. And I guarantee you, the rock will turn into dust, and the sons of thunder will whimper in the dark. They only follow you because you feed them and promise them thrones. Remove your hand of protection, and they will curse you. It was a valid legal claim. Their pride had opened the door. Satan demanded the right to sift them. Sifting wheat in the ancient world was a violent process. After the grain was harvested and threshed, beaten, to break the heads, it was tossed into a sieve. The sieve was shaken violently back and forth. The heavy grain would stay, but the dirt, the pebbles, and the chaff, the useless husks, would be separated. Satan wanted to shake Peter so violently that his faith would be revealed as nothing but chaff. He wanted to disorient him, to tumble him upside down until he didn't know up from down, until his loyalty broke. Peter sat frozen. The idea that his name had been spoken in the court of heaven by the Prince of Darkness was chilling. He was being targeted, not just attacked, but legally requested. But Jesus continued, and it was the most beautiful conjunction in the history of language. But I have prayed for you. Jesus had stood as the defense attorney. He had not blocked the trial. The sifting had to happen. The chaff had to be removed. Peter's pride was lethal. It had to die for Peter to live. So Jesus did not pray that Peter would escape the sifting. He prayed for the outcome. I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. He prayed for Simon specifically. The you in the first sentence, Satan demanded to have you, was plural. Satan wanted all 12. But the I have prayed for you was singular. Jesus focused his intercession on the leader, knowing that if the leader survived, the group survived. And when you have turned again, Jesus said, looking deep into Peter's confused eyes, strengthen your brothers. The sentence contained a hidden tragedy. When you have turned again. It implied that Peter was going to turn away. It implied a fall. It implied a desertion. Jesus was prophesying Peter's failure in the very same breath that he was prophesying his restoration. He was saying, you are going to fall, Simon. You are going to fail. The sifting will work. It will expose your weakness. But my prayer will hold you. You will return. And when you do, you will use your brokenness to build up the others. But Peter didn't hear the part about turning again. He only heard the implication that he needed prayer, that he was vulnerable. His pride, the very chaff that needed sifting, flared up instantly. He felt insulted. He felt the need to prove that Jesus' assessment was wrong. He looked around the table at the other disciples. He had to show them he was the strongest. Lord, Peter said, his voice rising with emotion, breathless with sincerity. I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. He meant it. Every cell in his body believed it. He reached down and felt the cold hilt of the short sword he had concealed under his cloak. He had prepared for this. He expected a fight. He expected the Romans or the temple guards to come with swords, and he was ready to die fighting. He imagined a heroic last stand, back to back with the Messiah, piling up bodies until they were overwhelmed. That was a death he could understand. That was a sifting he could handle. He did not understand that the enemy was not coming with a sword to take his life. The enemy was coming with fear to take his soul. He prepared for a physical battle, unaware that the battlefield was his own identity. Jesus looked at Peter with a sadness that was profound. He saw the sword under the cloak. He saw the fire in Peter's eyes. And he saw how quickly that fire would be extinguished by the cold word of a servant girl. I tell you, Peter, Jesus said, using his new name now, perhaps to highlight the irony of the rock crumbling. The rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. The room went deathly silent. A denial? Not just a moment of fear, not just running away, but a verbal disowning? I do not know him. It was inconceivable. To a Jewish disciple, denying one's rabbi was the ultimate betrayal. It was apostasy. Peter opened his mouth to protest, to argue, to swear an oath, but Jesus turned away. The conversation was over. The verdict was in. The sifting had begun. The meal ended with a hymn, likely the Hallel Psalms, sung in the wavering voices of men who felt the ground shifting beneath them. The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish. Then I called on the name of the Lord. The words must have tasted like ash in Peter's mouth. They left the upper room. They descended the stairs, leaving the safety of the walls, and stepped out into the Jerusalem night. The air was cool, biting. The moon was full, casting long, silver shadows across the stone streets. The city was humming with the energy of the Passover pilgrims, but the group moved in a bubble of silence. They walked through the Kidron Valley, crossing the brook that was likely running dark with the blood of the thousands of lambs slaughtered in the temple that afternoon. The smell of blood and campfire smoke filled their nostrils. They began the ascent up the Mount of Olives, toward the garden called Gethsemane. The oil press, the place of crushing. Peter walked close to Jesus, his hand never leaving the hilt of his sword. He was reeling. Satan wants me. Jesus thinks I will fail. A rooster? The mind of the fisherman was a storm. He felt a desperate need to prove Jesus wrong. He would stay awake. He would watch. He would fight. He would show the master that he was not Simon the sifter's wheat, but Peter the unmovable stone. But as they entered the garden, the atmosphere grew heavier. It wasn't just the darkness of the trees, it was a spiritual weight that pressed down on their chests. The sifting was not waiting for the arrest, it was starting now. A supernatural lethargy began to creep over them. Their eyelids felt like lead. Their limbs felt heavy. Jesus turned to them at the entrance of the garden. Pray that you may not enter into temptation. It was the same warning. The enemy is here. The trap is set. Pray. But Peter didn't feel like praying. He felt like fighting. And because he didn't know how to fight the invisible, he was powerless against the sleep that was dragging him down. He watched Jesus walk deeper into the shadows, into the place of private agony. He saw his master fall to the ground, not as a conqueror, but as a man broken. Peter sat down against the gnarled trunk of an olive tree. He told himself he would just rest his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. He needed his strength for the battle with the swords. He gripped his weapon. He watched the darkness. And then, the sifting began in earnest. Not with pain, but with comfort. The soft whisper of the wind in the olive leaves. The heavy scent of the earth. The exhaustion of the emotional roller coaster. Simon the fisherman began to drift. The spirit was willing, oh so willing, but the flesh was weak. His head nodded. His hand slipped from the sword. The rock of the church slumped sideways into the dirt, while the Son of God sweat drops of blood a stone's throw away. Wrestling for the salvation of the world, Peter slept. The first test had come, and he had already failed. He was asleep on the watch. And in the distance, the sound of marching feet and the clanking of lanterns began to echo across the Kidron Valley. The sifter was coming, and he would find the wheat unprepared. The air in the upper chamber was stagnant, thick with the smell of unwashed linen, sour wine, and the copper tang of old blood. It was a room that sunlight seemed to avoid, the single window draped with a heavy, moth-eaten tapestry that blocked out the vibrant, chaotic life of Ephesus outside. Inside, the silence was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. 7 men stood in a semicircle, their robes pristine, their beards oiled, their postures radiating the practiced arrogance of the Levitical aristocracy. These were the sons of Sceva, men born into the lineage of the high priesthood, men who believed that holiness was a heritage and power was a birthright. They had come to this squalid house in the lower quarter not out of compassion, but out of ambition. They were there to perform a transaction, to trade a name for a reputation. In the center of the room, seated on a rough wooden stool, was the man. He was unremarkable in physique, neither imposing nor frail, but there was a stillness about him that was unnatural. He did not rock back and forth like the madman in the marketplace. He did not mutter or scream. He sat with his head bowed, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man asleep or deep in meditation. But the sons of Sceva considered themselves experts. They knew that the thing inside him was watching them. They could feel its gaze, not from the man's eyes, but from the darkening corners of the room. The eldest brother, a tall man named Eliab, stepped forward. He adjusted the phylactery on his forehead, ensuring it was straight. He carried a small silver bowl of water and a branch of hyssop, tools of the trade that had served them well in minor exorcisms, or at least, in the theatrical displays they called exorcisms. This, however, was different. They were not here to use the old formulas of Solomon or the incantations of the temple. They were here to test a new weapon. They had seen the tentmaker, Paul, drive out spirits with a single word. They had seen the handkerchiefs from his skin heal the sick. They had watched the way the city of Ephesus, a city addicted to magic, had begun to turn toward this new way. And they wanted that power. They treated the name of the Nazarene not as a person to be worshipped, but as a password to be stolen. Eliab cleared his throat. The sound echoed too loudly in the small room. He looked at his brothers, receiving nods of encouragement. They were united in this. 7 against 1. The odds were mathematically comforting. Spirit, Eliab began, his voice booming with a theatrical baritone intended to intimidate. We know you are there. We know you hold this son of Abraham in chains. But the time of your habitation is at an end. The man on the stool did not move. He did not flinch. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, stretching toward the center like grasping fingers. We do not come to you with the authority of men, the second brother added, stepping up beside Eliab. We come with the authority of the high priesthood. We come with the lineage of Aaron. Still nothing. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. A fly buzzed near the ear of the youngest brother, and he swatted at it nervously. The lack of reaction was unsettling. Usually, the possessed would thrash or curse by now. The silence felt like a trap. Eliab frowned. He decided to skip the preamble. It was time to use the new formula. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the stale air. He raised his hand, pointing a manicured finger at the bowed head of the man. I adjure you, Eliab commanded, the words rehearsed and precise. I adjure you by the Jesus whom Paul preaches. The name hung in the air. Jesus. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The brothers exchanged glances, a flicker of doubt passing between them. Had they pronounced it wrong? Was there a specific intonation Paul used that they had missed? The magic of Ephesus was precise. One wrong syllable could render a spell useless. They assumed this operated on the same mechanics. Then, a sound came from the man. It was a low, dry chuckle. It sounded like dead leaves skittering over stone. The man lifted his head. The 7 brothers took an involuntary step back. The face that looked up at them was the face of the man they had brought in from the street, but the expression belonged to something else entirely. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and devoid of the white sclera. The pupils had dilated until they swallowed the irises, leaving 2 pools of absolute, abyssal blackness. The muscles in the man's face were slack, yet his mouth twisted into a grin that was too wide, stretching the skin until it looked ready to tear. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The temperature dropped, stealing the warmth from the air so quickly that the brothers' breath began to mist. The oil lamps flickered, the flames turning a sickly, greenish hue before dimming, casting the room into a twilight gloom. The chuckle grew into a laugh, a sound that vibrated in the brothers' chests, resonating in their bones. It was not the laugh of a madman. It was the laugh of a predator that has just realized the trap set for it was made of straw. You adjure me? The man spoke. The voice was not his own. It was a chorus of voices, a discordant harmony of guttural growls and high-pitched whispers layered over a human larynx. It sounded like gravel grinding in a mill. Eliab's hand trembled. He gripped the silver bowl tighter. We adjure you by Jesus, he stammered, his confidence evaporating like water on a hot stone. The Jesus of Paul. Come out. The possessed man stood up. He did not use his hands to push himself off the stool. He simply rose, unfolding with a fluid, unnatural grace that defied the laws of anatomy. He stood there, slumping slightly, his arms hanging long at his sides. Jesus, the voice hissed, savoring the syllables. The entity turned its head, cracking the neck vertebrae with a sound like a pistol shot. Jesus, I know. The entity used the word gnosko. It was a word of experiential knowledge. The demon was saying, I have met him. I met him in the wilderness when he fasted for 40 days. I met him in the synagogues of Galilee where he cast out my kin with a word. I met him at the tomb of the Magdalene. I saw him on the cross, and I trembled when the earth shook. I know his authority. I know his burning purity. I know the crushing weight of his heel." The brothers froze. The confession of the demon was more terrifying than any curse. It acknowledged the power they were trying to wield, but it did not bow to them. "And Paul," the entity continued, turning its black gaze toward the second brother. "Paul, I recognize. *epistemi. I understand who he is. I know his standing. I know the mark of ownership on his soul. I know the light that surrounds him, the light that blinded him on the Damascus road. I know the sound of his prayers that shake prison foundations. I know him as a general of the enemy army." The possessed man took a step forward. The floorboards groaned under a weight that seemed far greater than the physical mass of the human vessel. "But who are you?" The question was not an inquiry, it was an indictment. It was a dismantling of their identity. The demon looked at them. 7 men in fine linen, sons of a high priest, educated, wealthy, respected, and saw absolutely nothing. In the spiritual realm, they were blanks. They had no light. They had no seal. They had no standing. They were children playing with a loaded siege weapon, civilians walking onto a battlefield in paper armor. "Who are you?" The voice roared, the volume escalating to a deafening shriek that shattered the clay oil lamps. Darkness swallowed the room, save for the scant light bleeding through the threadbare tapestry. Panic erupted. "Do something, Eliab!" one of the younger brothers screamed. Eliab threw the water. "By the name of Jesus, I command." The sentence was never finished. The possessed man launched himself across the room. He moved with the speed of a striking viper and the force of a battering ram. He slammed into Eliab, lifting the large man off his feet and hurling him backward. Eliab hit the stone wall with a sickening crunch, the silver bowl clattering to the floor, spinning noisily in the sudden silence. The violence was instantaneous and overwhelming. This was not a brawl, it was a massacre. The demoniac did not fight like a man. He fought like a beast, utilizing teeth, nails, and supernatural strength that tore through muscle and fabric alike. He landed on the second brother, Hophni, before Eliab had even slid to the floor. Hophni tried to raise his arms to protect his face, but the demoniac grabbed his wrists. With a casual, brutal twist, there was a snap of bone, and Hophni screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. The demoniac bit down on Hophni's shoulder, tearing through the expensive priestly tunic and the flesh beneath, ripping away a mouthful of meat like a wolf. "You use the name?" The demon roared, spitting blood and fabric. "You dare to mouth the name?" The remaining 5 brothers scrambled, tripping over each other in the dark, desperate to reach the door. But the door was barred, locked from the inside by their own arrogance, intended to keep the public out while they performed their miracle. Now, it was the lid of their coffin. The third brother, Mary, reached the latch, his fingers slick with sweat and shaking so badly he couldn't find the purchase. He felt a hand grab the back of his robe. He was yanked backward with such force that his feet left the ground. He was thrown across the room, crashing into the heavy oak table, splintering it. The demoniac was a blur of motion in the shadows. He was everywhere at once. He stripped them. It was a specific, humiliating violence. He didn't just want to hurt them, he wanted to expose them. He grabbed the fine linen robes, the symbols of their status, and shredded them like papyrus. He tore the phylacteries from their brows, the sign of their religious devotion, and crushed them under his bare feet. "You are naked." The voice taunted, sounding from the corner where 2 brothers were cowering. "You have no covering. You have no armor. You stand before the darkness with nothing but your pride." One brother, the youngest, managed to find a heavy iron candlestick. He swung it wildly in the dark, weeping in terror. "Stay back, stay back." The demoniac caught the iron bar mid-swing. He didn't flinch. He caught it with one hand, his grip stopping the momentum instantly. He wrenched it from the boy's hand and tossed it aside as if it were a straw. Then he backhanded the boy, a blow that sent him spinning into the far wall, blood spraying from a broken nose. The room was a cacophony of screams, the sound of tearing cloth, and the wet thud of blows. The smell of fear, sharp, acrid, unmistakable, mixed with the smell of fresh blood. Eliab, dazed and gasping for air, tried to crawl toward the door. His ribs were broken, he could feel them shifting with every breath. He looked up to see the demoniac standing over him. The man's chest was heaving, but not from exertion, from excitement. He was enjoying this. He was reveling in the authority he had over these pretenders. "Jesus, I know," the demon whispered, leaning down, his face inches from Eliab's. The breath of the possessed man smelled of rot and sulfur. Paul the first recognized. "But you are meat." The demoniac grabbed Eliab by the hair and the remains of his tunic. He dragged him to the center of the room and threw him onto the pile of his moaning brothers. They were a heap of broken, bleeding humanity. 7 men who had walked in as lords were now writhing like worms. The entity stood over them, victorious. "Run," it hissed. "Run to your father. Run to your temple. Tell them that the name is not a toy. Tell them that hell has teeth." With a final, terrifying roar, the demoniac kicked the door. The heavy wooden bar shattered. The door flew off its hinges, crashing into the dusty street outside. The brothers did not need to be told twice. Driven by a primal terror that overrode their pain, they scrambled to their feet. They did not help each other. There was no brotherhood left, only the desperate, animalistic need to survive. They burst out of the house and into the streets of Ephesus. It was midday. The sun was blindingly bright, a harsh contrast to the tomb-like gloom of the house. The market street was crowded. Merchants were hawking spices, silversmiths were hammering out shrines to Artemis, and citizens were going about their daily business. And then, the 7 sons of Sceva appeared. They were a sight that stopped the heart of the city. They were naked, their pale skin exposed to the harsh light. They were wounded, covered in deep scratches, bite marks, and bruises that were already blooming dark purple. Blood streamed from their noses and scalps, matting their hair and running down their chests. They were screaming, incoherent babbles of terror, looking behind them as if the hounds of Hades were nipping at their heels. A woman dropping a basket of figs screamed. A Roman soldier put his hand to his gladius, confused by the sudden eruption of chaos. A group of silversmiths stopped their work, staring in open-mouthed shock. These were not beggars. Even in their nakedness and blood, the city recognized them. That was Eliab. That was the son of the high priest. These were the men who walked the colonnades in flowing robes, looking down on the common people. These were the men who claimed to hold the keys to the spiritual realm. And they were running, weeping, and bleeding, utterly defeated. They ran past the agora. They ran past the library of Celsus. They did not stop until they collapsed in the courtyard of their own lodging, gasping for air, clutching their wounds, their dignity left in shreds on the floor of a demoniac's hovel. The silence that followed their flight in the street was heavy. The people of Ephesus looked at the open door of the house where the exorcism had taken place. No one dared to go near it. A cold wind seemed to blow from the doorway, carrying the scent of something ancient and angry. News traveled fast in Ephesus. Faster than the ships in the harbor. Within the hour, the story was on the lips of every merchant, every slave, and every magistrate. "Did you hear? Sceva's sons. They tried to use the name of the Nazarene. The Spirit broke them. It said it knew Jesus. It said it knew Paul. But it did not know them." The implications hit the city like a physical blow. Ephesus was a city built on the foundation of magic. The Ephesian letters, spells and incantations, were famous throughout the world. The people believed that if you had the right words, the right formula, you could control the gods. You could manipulate the spirits. It was a mechanical view of the divine. But this event shattered that worldview. The name of Jesus was not a spell. It was not a magic word that worked for anyone who said it. It was a name that carried authority, an authority that required relationship. Paul had that relationship. Sceva's sons did not. A fear began to settle over the city. It was not a panic, but a holy dread. It was the realization that the spiritual war Paul spoke of was real, and that the sides were drawn not by ritual, but by allegiance. The gods of Ephesus, Artemis, the spirits, the household idols, suddenly seemed small and petty compared to the power that had stripped the 7 sons of Sceva naked. In the house of a silversmith named Demetrius, the mood was dark. He heard the news and felt a knot of cold fear in his stomach. If the name of this Jesus was so powerful that even the demons respected it, and so dangerous that to misuse it meant destruction, what would happen to the trade of Artemis? What would happen to the statues? But in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, where Paul was teaching, the mood was different. Paul paused in his discourse. He saw the faces of the new believers entering the hall, their eyes wide with the news. They told him what had happened. They told him of the demon's testimony. Paul the first recognize? Paul did not smile. He did not gloat. He bowed his head. He knew the danger these men had put themselves in. He knew the reality of the enemy. But he also saw the hand of God moving in the chaos. The counterfeit had been exposed. The true power had been distinguished from the false. As the sun began to set over the harbor, turning the water to blood red, a movement began in the city. It started with one man, a magician who had practiced the dark arts for 40 years. He went to his home, opened a hidden chest, and pulled out a scroll. It was a scroll of curses, a scroll he had paid a fortune for. He looked at it, and then he looked at his hands, hands that were clean, unlike the bloody hands of Sceva's sons. He realized that the scroll was not power. It was a chain. He left his house and walked toward the public square. He was not alone. From the side streets and the alleys, others were coming. They carried books. They carried scrolls. They carried the accumulated wisdom of Ephesus, the magic that had defined their lives. They were converging. The incident with the 7 sons had acted as a catalyst, piercing the veil of deception that hung over the city. They realized that you cannot negotiate with the dark. You cannot manage it. You can only defeat it with the light, or be devoured by it. The fear of the Lord fell on them all, and the name of the Lord Jesus was magnified. Not as a magic word, but as the King of Kings. Back in the quiet of his room, Paul prayed. He prayed for the 7 brothers, that their humiliation would lead to repentance. And he prayed for Ephesus. He knew that the fire that was about to be lit in the city square would burn brighter than any temple flame. The demon had meant to mock the authority of Christ by destroying the impostors, but in doing so, it had inadvertently preached the greatest sermon Ephesus had ever heard. Jesus is Lord, and he has no rivals. The night deepened, but in the hearts of the Ephesians, the dawn was breaking. The age of magic was ending, the age of the kingdom had begun. And somewhere in the dark, licking his wounds, the enemy realized he had overplayed his hand. He had stripped 7 men naked, but he had clothed the city in truth. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon of the Aegean Sea, casting long, bruised shadows across the marble thoroughfares of Ephesus, but the city was not settling into its usual evening rhythm of revelry and trade. There was a tension in the air, a static charge that prickled the skin, born from the whisper that had raced from the harbor to the precipice of Mount Keresos. The house of Sceva had fallen. The masters of the spiritual hierarchy had been stripped, beaten, and cast out by a force they claimed to command. The implications of this event were rippling through the psyche of the metropolis like cracks in a dam, and the water was beginning to burst through. In the center of the public square, near the great agora, a movement was taking shape that was unlike anything the Roman proconsuls or the priests of Artemis had ever witnessed. It began silently, with individual figures emerging from the deepening twilight. They came from the wealthy villas on the terraced slopes, and they came from the cramped tenements of the lower city. They walked with their heads bowed, carrying burdens that were heavy not in physical weight, but in spiritual cost. A man named Elian, a practitioner of the dark arts who had sold charms to sailors for 20 years, approached the center of the square. In his arms, he clutched a bundle of scrolls wrapped in lambskin. These were not ordinary texts. They were the Ephesia Grammata, the renowned Ephesian letters, containing formulas for binding spirits, cursing rivals, and ensuring safe passage across the treacherous seas. To Elian, these scrolls were his livelihood, his identity, and his retirement. They represented decades of accumulated knowledge, secrets whispered in the back rooms of temples, and significant sums of silver paid to masters from Babylon and Egypt. Yesterday, he would have killed to protect them. Today, the leather felt like it was burning his skin. He threw them onto the pavement. The sound of the heavy parchment hitting the stone was a dull thud, but in the hush of the gathering crowd, it sounded like a thunderclap. It was the first stone of an avalanche. A woman, veiled and weeping, stepped forward and dropped a small, ornate box. It burst open, spilling amulets made of bone and silver, carved with the grotesque faces of protective deities that had failed to protect the sons of Sceva. A young man, barely out of his apprenticeship in the Guild of Magicians, threw down a stack of papyrus codices, his hands shaking as if he were handling venomous snakes. The pile grew. It became a mound, then a hill, then a mountain of accumulated darkness. There were scrolls of astrology that mapped the tyranny of the stars. There were grimoires filled with the names of powers that demanded blood for favors. There were tablets of lead inscribed with curses intended to wither the crops of neighbors or strike enemies with fever. It was the spiritual sewage of a city that had spent centuries trying to manipulate the divine, now dragged out into the open air. Paul stood on the edge of the square, watching. He did not orchestrate this. He had not commanded them to bring their books. This was the work of the Holy Spirit, the conviction that comes when the counterfeit is exposed by the presence of the true. He watched as men who had spent fortunes acquiring these lies now vied with each other to be the first to discard them. He saw the fear in their eyes, but it was a good fear. It was the fear of the Lord, the beginning of wisdom. They had realized that the name of Jesus was not a magic word to be added to their collection, but a consuming fire that demanded the incineration of everything else. A torch was brought forward. It was held by a former priest of a minor cult who had heard Paul speak in the hall of Tyrannus 3 months prior. He looked at Paul, seeking permission, seeking confirmation. Paul simply nodded. The man lowered the torch. The dry papyrus caught instantly. A tongue of orange flame licked up the side of the pile, devouring the ink and the leather. The fire roared to life, hungry and violent. It illuminated the faces of the thousands who had gathered, faces marked by tears, by shock, and by a strange, dawning relief. As the smoke rose, thick and black, blotting out the first stars of the evening, a smell filled the square. It was the scent of burning leather and melting wax, but beneath it, there was the metaphorical stench of a spiritual infection being cauterized. The value of the pyre was staggering. A merchant standing near the edge of the crowd, a man used to calculating the worth of cargo from the east, did the mental arithmetic. He looked at the rare bindings, the gold-leafed text, the antiquity of the scrolls curling into ash. He whispered the number to his neighbor, and it spread through the crowd. 50,000 pieces of silver. 50,000 drachmas. A single drachma was the wage of a skilled laborer for a full day's work. This fire was consuming the equivalent of 137 years of human labor. It was a fortune that could have built a fleet of ships, renovated the aqueducts, or fed the poor of Ephesus for a decade. In any other context, it would have been an act of madness, a waste of capital that would make a banker weep. But here, in the light of the flames, the people understood the true economy of the kingdom. To keep these books was to keep a tether to the demonic. To sell them was to infect another. The only way to be free was to destroy them. They were buying their freedom with ash. As the fire raged, casting long, dancing shadows against the columns of the surrounding buildings, a silence broke. It wasn't a speech or a sermon. It was a confession. Men and women began to speak aloud, confessing their deeds. They divulged the secrets they had held for years, the curses they had paid for, the illicit affairs they had covered up with charms, the idols they hid under their beds. The power of the enemy, which relies on secrecy and darkness, was broken by the light of the fire and the open declaration of truth. The smoke from the great bonfire drifted over the city, carried by the sea breeze. It swirled through the marble streets, past the library of Celsus, and up the slopes towards the temple of Artemis. Demetrius stood on the balcony of his workshop, watching the plume of black smoke rising against the moonlit sky. He was a silversmith, a master craftsman, and a man of significant influence in the city. His workshop was a factory of devotion, producing hundreds of silver shrines of Artemis, miniature replicas of the great temple that tourists and pilgrims bought to take home. For years, business had been booming. Artemis was the heart of Ephesus. She was the multi-breasted provider, the goddess of fertility, the hunter, the protector. Her temple was one of the wonders of the world, a bank, a sanctuary, and the engine of the Ephesian economy. But lately, the engine had been sputtering. Demetrius turned away from the balcony and walked back into his workshop. It was quiet now, the hammers silent, the fires in the forges banked for the night. Rows of finished shrines sat on the shelves, gleaming in the lamplight. Beautiful, intricate, and increasingly unsold. He picked one up, feeling the cool weight of the silver. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but to the people down in the square burning their books, it was nothing more than metal. That was the problem. This Paul, this Jewish tentmaker, was not just preaching a new God. He was destroying the market for the old ones. He was telling people that gods made with hands were no gods at all. It was a simple theological statement, but it was an economic catastrophe for Demetrius. He had watched the sales drop month by month. First, it was the Jews who stopped buying. That was expected. Then, the God-fearers, the Greeks who hung around the synagogue. But now, it was the common people. The magicians, the sailors, the farmers. They were throwing away their charms. They were ignoring the festivals. And now, they were burning 50,000 drachmas worth of magic books. If they were willing to burn their books, how long before they melted down their silver shrines? Demetrius felt a cold anger tightening in his chest. This was not just about religion. This was about survival. This was about the dignity of his trade and the glory of his city. If this way was allowed to spread, the temple of Artemis, the pride of Asia, would be reduced to a pile of rocks, and his guild would be destitute. He knew he had to act. The incident with the Sons of Sceva had terrified the city, but fear is a volatile energy. It can be directed. It can be turned into rage. The next morning, the atmosphere in Ephesus was hungover. The smell of ash still lingered in the square. The Christians were joyful, moving with a lightness of spirit, but the rest of the city was uneasy. The power vacuum left by the humiliation of the magicians and the destruction of the books was creating a sense of vulnerability. Demetrius sent out runners to the other craftsmen. The silversmiths, the coppersmiths, the sculptors, the engravers. He called for an emergency meeting of the guild. They gathered in a large hall near the commercial agora, men with strong arms and hard faces, men whose livelihoods depended on the worship of the goddess. Demetrius stood on a raised platform. He did not need to shout to get their attention. The fear in their eyes did the work for him. "Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth," he began, his voice low and reasonable. He held up a silver shrine, letting the light catch it. "This is not just our art. This is our bread. This is the roof over our heads and the food for our children." He paused, letting the reality sink in. Then he pointed a finger toward the lecture hall of Tyrannus. "And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus but in almost all of Asia this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. They had all felt the pinch. They had all seen the empty shops. Demetrius raised his voice, injecting it with passion. "And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship." He hit the two nerves that controlled the city, their wallet and their pride. He linked their financial ruin to the blasphemy of their goddess. He made the attack on their business an attack on their identity. The reaction was instantaneous. The anger that had been simmering under the surface boiled over. A craftsman at the back shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." It was a spark in a room full of gunpowder. Another took up the cry. Then another, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis." The meeting dissolved into a mob. They poured out of the hall and into the street. The chant grew louder, feeding on itself, becoming a rhythmic, hypnotic roar. They were not looking for debate anymore, they were looking for blood. They wanted to find Paul. They swept through the streets like a flood. They rushed to the place where Paul usually stayed, but he was not there. Instead, they found Gaius and Aristarchus, two Macedonians who were Paul's traveling companions. The mob seized them. There was no trial, no questions. They dragged the two men toward the great theater. The theater of Ephesus was a massive structure carved into the side of Mount Pion. It could hold 25,000 people. The acoustics were perfect. A whisper on the stage could be heard in the highest seats. Now, it became the bowl for a chaotic stew of rage. The mob flooded into the theater, dragging the confused Macedonians with them. The news of the riot spread instantly. Shopkeepers closed their stalls and ran to join the commotion. Citizens woke from their naps and hurried to the mountain. Within the hour, the theater was packed, but it was a riot of confusion. Luke, the historian, would later record with a touch of irony that the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some thought it was a protest against taxes. Some thought it was a Jewish uprising. Some just heard the shouting and wanted to be part of the event. But the core of the silversmiths kept the chant alive, a beating heart of idolatry. "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Paul, hearing the noise from a safe house, wanted to go in. He was a man who had never backed down from a fight. He wanted to stand on the stage and preach the gospel to 25,000 angry pagans. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. But the disciples would not let him. Even the Osiarchs, the officials of the province who were friendly to him, sent word begging him not to venture into the theater. This was not a crowd that could be reasoned with. This was a beast. Inside the theater, the Jews of the city were terrified. They knew that pagan mobs often failed to distinguish between Christians and Jews. To the Ephesians, they were all just atheists who rejected the gods. They pushed a man named Alexander to the front, hoping he could make a defense, to explain that the Jews had nothing to do with Paul. Alexander stood before the sea of people in motion with his hand for silence. But when the crowd recognized him as a Jew, it had the opposite effect. It confirmed their suspicion that their gods were under attack by monotheists. The sight of him unified the mob. They stopped arguing. They stopped questioning. They became a single organism with a single voice. For 2 hours, the massive stone bowl of the theater reverberated with one continuous, deafening chant. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. It was a wall of sound, a mantra of desperation. They were shouting to convince themselves. They were shouting to drown out the memory of the burning books. They were shouting to silence the gnawing fear that the demon had been right, that Jesus was the one with the power, and Artemis was just a statue. Finally, when the sun was high and throats were raw, the town clerk made his way to the stage. He was the Grammatius, the highest-ranking official in the city, the liaison between Ephesus and Rome. He was a politician, a man of order and pragmatism. He walked to the center of the stage, his presence commanding authority. He waited. Slowly, the chanting died down. The people looked at him, panting, sweating, waiting for approval. He did not give it. He gave them a cold dose of reality. Men of Ephesus, he began, his voice amplified by the acoustics. Who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? He affirmed their religion, soothing their ego. Of course Artemis is great. That is a fact. It doesn't need to be shouted for 2 hours. Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. He pointed to Gaius and Aristarchus, who were bruised and standing to the side. For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. It was a shrewd legal defense. Paul and his friends hadn't physically smashed idols. They hadn't robbed the temple. They had simply preached truth. If the truth destroyed the idols, that wasn't a crime under Roman law. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. He turned the mob into a lawsuit. He took the passion out of the air and replaced it with bureaucracy. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. This was the threat that mattered. Rome tolerated many things, but it did not tolerate disorder. If the legions had to march in from the garrison to put down a riot, the city would lose its freedom. The status of free city would be revoked. The taxes would go up. The games would be cancelled. The crowd realized the danger. The frenzy evaporated, replaced by the mundane fear of Roman punishment. The silversmiths looked at their shoes. Demetrius realized he had lost. He had started a fire he couldn't control, and now the state was dousing it. With that, he dismissed the assembly. The crowd dispersed. They filed out of the theater, quiet and exhausted. The energy was gone. The chant was silenced. But as they walked back to their homes, past the charred patch of pavement in the square where the books had burned, they knew that nothing was the same. The town clerk had restored order, but he hadn't restored the faith. The shout of, "Great is Artemis," had been a death rattle. The silence that followed was the silence of a tomb. The goddess had been defended by a mob, but she hadn't acted. She hadn't struck Paul down. She hadn't saved her own shrines. She had needed a politician to save her worshippers from the Roman law. Paul waited until the uproar had ceased. He knew his time in Ephesus was done. He had fought with beasts at Ephesus, both spiritual and human. He had seen the power of the enemy crumble. He had planted a church that was now forged in fire. He called the disciples to him. They gathered in the house of a believer, a room far different from the one Sceva's sons had used. It was filled with light, with bread, with wine. He encouraged them. He told them that this was the way of the kingdom, conflict, victory, and the endurance of faith. He embraced them, and he departed for Macedonia. He left the city, but he left behind a fortress. The church of Ephesus would become a pillar of the faith. It would be the church of Timothy, the church of the Apostle John, the church where Mary the mother of Jesus would eventually rest. The massive temple of Artemis would eventually crumble, its stones scavenged to build churches and aqueducts, its site turning into a swamp, forgotten by time. But the word that grew mightily and prevailed in the square of the burning books would endure forever. The 7 sons of Sceva had tried to steal a name and had lost their clothes. Demetrius had tried to save a business and lost his goddess. But in the quiet hearts of the thousands who had watched the smoke rise and the idols fall, the name of Jesus had taken root, not as a magic spell, but as the only solid ground in a world of shifting shadows. The battle for Ephesus was over. The idols remained standing for a time, but they were hollow. The Spirit had left the building of stone and taken up residence in the building of flesh. And as Paul walked the road north, the wind from the sea seemed to carry the whisper of a new era, an age where the demons trembled not at rituals, but at the righteousness of the saints. The morning mist clinging to the harbor of Ephesus was cool and gray, a soothing balm over a city that had screamed itself hoarse the day before. The great stone bowl of the theater, which had amplified the rage of 25,000 throats chanting the greatness of Artemis, now stood empty and silent, a hollow monument to a hysteria that had evaporated with the dew. The streets were quiet, save for the rhythmic sweeping of brooms as shopkeepers cleared the debris of the riot, their eyes downcast, their movements hurried. There was a collective shame hanging over the metropolis, the kind of hangover that follows a night of drunken excess where much was said but nothing was accomplished. The goddess had been defended, yet she felt more distant than ever, her silence deafening in the wake of the mob's roar. In the house of Aquila and Priscilla, the mood was somber but laced with a resilient, quiet joy. The shutters were drawn against the prying eyes of the street, but inside, the lamps burned with a warm, steady glow. Paul stood in the center of the room, his travel cloak already fastened around his shoulders, his leather bag packed with the few parchments and tools he carried. The disciples surrounded him, a tight circle of men and women whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the message this small, scarred man had brought to their shores. There was Timothy, young and earnest, his eyes red from weeping. There was Erastus, the city treasurer who had risked his station for the truth. And there were the former magicians, men who had burned their fortunes in the square, now standing with empty hands but full hearts. Paul looked at them, etching their faces into his memory. He knew the nature of the war they were fighting. He knew that the enemy, having failed to destroy them with the brute force of the riot and the terror of the demoniac, would now shift tactics. The wolf would put on sheep's clothing. The attack would come from within, through distortion and compromise. He spoke to them not with the fiery rhetoric he used in the hall of Tyrannus, but with the tender gravity of a father leaving his children in a land of wolves. He reminded them that the power they had witnessed, the power that stripped the sons of Sceva and silenced the silversmiths, did not belong to them. It resided in the name, and the name could only be wielded by those who belonged to the shepherd. He warned them that after his departure, savage wolves would come in among them, not sparing the flock. He told them that even from their own number, men would arise speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. It was a sobering prophecy. The victory over the books of magic and the mob was not the end of the war, it was merely the end of the opening campaign. The true battle would be the long, grinding struggle to remain faithful when the adrenaline faded and the world tried to seduce them back into the dark. They knelt together on the rough stone floor. The prayers offered that morning were not the polished incantations of the temple priests. They were raw, broken outpourings of spirit, heavy with tears. They embraced him, kissing him on the neck, grieving most of all because he had told them that they would not see his face again. The finality of the moment pressed on them. The ship was waiting at the pier, bound for Macedonia, and the tide would not wait for their grief. They walked him to the ship. It was a public procession, not of triumph, but of love. As Paul stepped onto the gangplank, the city of Ephesus lay behind him, a skyline dominated by the massive white marble pillars of the Temple of Artemis. It looked immutable, eternal, a mountain of stone and gold. But Paul looked at it with the eyes of a man who had seen the unseen. He knew it was already a ruin. He knew that the fire initiated by the Holy Spirit in the hearts of the Ephesians was a slow-burning flame that would eventually consume the very foundations of that pagan edifice. He waved one last time, the ropes were cast off, and the vessel drifted into the deep blue of the Aegean, carrying the apostle away to new battlefields. While the ship disappeared over the horizon, a different kind of departure was taking place in the high district of the city, in the villa of the high priest Sceva. The shutters here were closed tight, not for prayer, but for shame. The 7 brothers sat in the atrium, the silence between them thick and suffocating. Their physical wounds were beginning to heal. The bruises were fading to yellow and green, the cuts scabbing over, the nakedness covered by fresh tunics. But the internal disfigurement was festering. Eliab, the eldest, sat staring at a mosaic on the floor, tracing the pattern of a geometric border with his eyes, over and over, desperate to keep his mind from replaying the memory of the dark room. He could still smell the rot of the demon's breath. He could still feel the supernatural strength that had tossed him like a rag doll. But worst of all, he could still hear the voice. That terrible, gravelly voice that had dismantled his entire existence with a single question. Who are you? It was not just a question of identity. It was a judgment of substance. The demon had looked at his lineage, his priestly robes, his education, his wealth, and his ambition, and had seen a vacuum. He was a man with no weight in the spirit. He was a hollow shell painted to look like a soldier. The humiliation was total. They could not go to the marketplace. They could not go to the baths. Everywhere they went, they felt the eyes of the city on them. They were the men who had run naked. They were the charlatans exposed by hell itself. Sceva, their father, paced the perimeter of the room. He was a man whose power was built on reputation, and his sons had incinerated it in a single afternoon. He looked at them with a mixture of pity and disgust. He wanted to rage at them for their incompetence, for trying to steal a power they didn't understand, but he couldn't. The fear in their eyes was too raw. He knew that they had touched something that he, with all his years of ritual and politics, had never encountered. They had touched the reality of the spiritual world, and it had broken them. Sceva stopped pacing and looked at Eliab. He demanded to know if they could try again, if there was a ritual of cleansing, a sacrifice to Apollo or Artemis that could restore their standing. He spoke of public appearances, of damage control, of hiring rhetoricians to spin the story. He was a man trying to fix a supernatural breach with political mortar. Eliab looked up, his eyes dead and hollow. He whispered that there was no fixing this. He told his father that the gods of Ephesus were silent. He told him that when the demon screamed the name of Jesus, the air in the room had become heavy with a presence that made the statues in the temple look like toys. He confessed that they were lucky to be alive. The 7 brothers knew something their father did not. They knew that the universe was not a marketplace of competing favors where you could bargain for power. It was a kingdom ruled by a king who knew his own, and to pretend to be his subject while serving his enemy was a death sentence. They retreated into obscurity. The 7 sons of Sceva, once the golden youth of the priestly aristocracy, became ghosts in their own city. They never attempted an exorcism again. They flinched at the mention of the Nazarene. They lived out their days in the shadow of the question that had unmade them, haunted by the realization that they had stood on the threshold of truth and had been rejected because they sought the power of God without the person of God. Down in the commercial district, the silence of the gods was also being felt in the ledger books of Demetrius. The silversmith stood in his workshop, the fires of the forge cold. The riot had saved the temple from physical destruction, but it could not save the trade from spiritual irrelevance. The shouting in the theater had been a cathartic release of fear, but it hadn't brought the customers back. The pilgrims still came, staring up at the massive columns of the Artemision, awestruck by its architectural grandeur, but fewer and fewer were buying the silver shrines. The burning of the books had changed the atmosphere of the city. The fear of magic, which drove people to buy protective amulets and idols, had been broken. The people who had turned to the way of Paul walked with a confidence that required no silver talisman. They prayed to an invisible God who heard them, a God who didn't need to be carried in a pocket or placed on a shelf. Demetrius watched his apprentices polishing the same inventory for weeks. He realized with a sinking dread that he was no longer a provider of sacred necessities. He was a manufacturer of obsolete trinkets. He tried to innovate. He tried to make the shrines more ornate, more affordable. He tried to start rumors that the Christians were atheists who hated humanity. But the momentum of history had shifted. The economy of idolatry was collapsing because the currency of fear had been devalued. The gospel had introduced a better currency, love and power. Demetrius grew old in a shop that smelled of metal and disappointment, watching the slow, inexorable rise of a faith that built no temples, carved no statues, and yet commanded the loyalty of the human heart in a way Artemis never could. Years turned into decades. The dust of the Roman roads settled over the footprints of Paul, but the fire he lit in Ephesus continued to burn. The church that started in the lecture hall of Tyrannus grew into a mighty cedar of Lebanon. It weathered the storms of persecution under Nero and Domitian. It stood firm against the heresies that Paul had warned them about. It became a center of theology and love, the home of the Apostle John in his old age, the place where the deep mysteries of the Word were pondered and written down. The great temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, began its long, slow descent into oblivion. It wasn't destroyed by a Christian mob or a decree from an apostle. It died the death of neglect. As the faith in the living God spread, the funds to maintain the massive structure dried up. The roof began to leak. The paint peeled from the columns. The weeds grew in the cracks of the marble steps where millions had once ascended to worship. In the year 262 AD, the Goths came down from the north and sacked the city, setting fire to the temple. The roof, made of heavy cedar beams, collapsed into the sanctuary. The goddess, who had been shouted about for 2 hours in the theater, did not save her own house. She burned with it. Later, the stones of the temple were scavenged. The marble that had been quarried with such effort was dragged away to build churches, bathhouses, and fortifications. The great pillars were pulled down and used to line the streets of a Christian empire. Eventually, the Cayster River silted up the harbor. The sea receded, leaving Ephesus stranded inland. The city that had been the gateway to Asia became a malarial swamp. The great theater was buried under layers of mud and earth. The house of Sceva, the workshop of Demetrius, the hall of Tyrannus, all of them were swallowed by the earth, lost to memory. But the name remained. In the quiet ruins, centuries later, if one were to listen closely to the wind blowing through the reeds of the marshland that covered the ancient harbor, one would not hear the chant of, "Great is Artemis." That sound had been swallowed by the void of history. Instead, the enduring legacy of Ephesus was found in the texts that survived, the letters written to this city by Paul and John, and the testimony of the martyrs who died singing the name of the Nazarene. The story of the 7 sons of Sceva became a warning parable for every generation of believers. It stood as a stark reminder that the kingdom of God is not a realm of magic or technique. It is a realm of relationship. The demons had exposed the great lie of religion without relationship. They had proven that you cannot borrow authority. You cannot wear the armor of a king you do not serve. The ultimate tragedy of the 7 brothers was not that they were beaten and stripped naked. It was that they had been in the presence of the truth and treated it like a tool. They had stood inches away from the power that created the stars, the power that could heal the sick and raise the dead, and they tried to use it to boost their own reputation. They wanted the demons to obey them, but they refused to obey Jesus, and so, the question that the demons screamed in the dark room echoes down through the corridors of time, bypassing the sons of Sceva and landing squarely in the heart of every seeker, every pretender, and every believer. It is the question that strips away the titles, the robes, the religious language, and the cultural Christianity. It is the question that waits at the threshold of the spiritual world, guarding the entrance to true power. Jesus I know. And Paul the first recognize. But who are you? It asks. Are you known? Does your name carry weight in the heavens because it is hidden in his name? Do you walk in the authority of a surrendered life, or are you walking in the fragile armor of your own pride? The true exorcists, the true saints who walked in the footsteps of Paul, knew the answer. They were the ones who could stand before the darkness and not be afraid, not because they were strong, but because they had died to themselves. They were the ones who could say to the darkness, "It does not matter who I am. I am nothing, but I am with him, and you know who he is." This is the secret that burned the books in the square. This is the secret that silenced the silversmiths. This is the secret that outlasted the marble of Artemis. The power of the name is not in the syllables, but in the intimacy. It is the property of those who can look at the king and say, "I am his," and hear the king reply in the presence of men, angels, and demons, "And he is mine." The sun sets over the modern ruins of Ephesus today. A few broken columns of the Temple of Artemis stand in a swamp, topped by stork nests, lonely and pathetic. The theater is excavated, a tourist attraction where visitors take pictures and imagine the roar of the crowd. But the church that was born in the fire of that revival is alive. It is alive in every corner of the globe, in every heart that bows to the lordship of Jesus. The magic books are ash. The silver shrines are dust. But the word of the Lord has grown mightily and prevailed. an eternal flame that no darkness can extinguish, a testimony that the Jesus who was known by the demons is the same Jesus who is loved by the saints, the conqueror of the grave, the Lord of glory, the name above all names. The night in the house of Sceva was dark, and the violence was terrible, but it served the light. It stripped the mask off the world and revealed the terrifying, beautiful simplicity of the gospel. There is no middle ground. There is no borrowed power. There is only the King, and those who know him. And for those who know him, even the gates of hell cannot prevail. The story of Ephesus ends not with the scream of a demon or the riot of a mob, but with the quiet, enduring triumph of the truth. The wheat has been sifted from the chaff. The silver has been refined in the fire. And what remains is the kingdom that cannot be shaken.